2030, Gen Z and millennials will dominate the workforce, and yet most leaders still have no clue how to communicate with them. Today, we're going to fix all that. Welcome back to Speaking with Confidence, the podcast that helps you build the soft skills that lead to real results. Communication, storytelling, public speaking, and showing up with confidence in every conversation that counts. I'm Tim Newman, a recovering college professor turned communication coach, and I'm thrilled to guide you on a journey to becoming a powerful communicator. Today's guest is Robin Lewis. Robin is the host of the Big Life podcast. He is also a leadership coach, transformational speaker, and business strategist who helps purpose-driven business owners lead with clarity, build with focus, and grow businesses that truly last. Robin, welcome to Speaking with Confidence.
Hey, Tim. So good to be here with you. I appreciate the opportunity to come and share with your listeners.
Well, it's we've been friends for, not very long, but we've got a lot of things that are in common. And just before we started recording, we talked about family and building those intentional relationships, especially with the younger ones, the grandkids. How has that kind of shaped the way that you lead and communicate?
Yeah, man. Well, very much. I can tell you, for example, specifically, you and I were talking about the grandkids, and we just had our first one. He's just a year and a half now, so brand new still. And one of the things that struck me, for example, that I actually share with others, I've done a few talks around it, is this idea of crawling and falling and walking. So seeing my grandson, how he tackles learning, he's very curious and very persistent, and he's not afraid of falling. He loves to climb. He loves to try. So, he started, and now he's trying to talk, so I'm seeing this take place. So I'm painting the picture for our listeners because, you kind of a couple of things that struck me with it that's relevant to leadership and such is that we were actually born with this hunger to learn.
Yeah.
And it actually comes naturally. And it's about crawling. It started with him crawling, Tim, and falling, trying to get up and then falling. And, I won't go through the whole long process, but you know what I'm talking about, where then he started to walk. And that process is something that I think all of us as leaders need to come back to, because I think a lot of times we get away from it. We allow what other people think, how we might look if we fail. We don't want to fail. We don't want to fall. And we're concerned about how we might look and what others might think. And then we get away from actually crawling and falling and walking.
Yeah.
And what I suggest to leaders is that is something that we need to continually do. And so I don't mean to take this off in that direction, but that's the first thing that comes to my mind. What you and I were talking about now too is how precious the grandkids are and family, and how we want to arrange our lives and be intentional about being able to spend time with them and to have input in their lives and so on.
Yeah. And there's so much to unpack there. I mean, just from that perspective, what we can learn from young people, right? Because we forget, we forget about what that learning process is. We forget about, the idea of, you talked about crawling and walking and running. I look at it from tying shoes and eating and talking. How young people, especially little kids, they say whatever's on their mind. And then by the time we're 11, we don't say anything. So it becomes learned behavior to bottle things up and not share things, not share ideas, not share thoughts. So, and then by the time, they get to the young adults, young professionals, they're so they're so bottled up that they've really truly forgotten how to communicate, and then we have to undo all of those things. So we've got to
Yeah.
find ways to encourage. Obviously, there's a right way and a wrong way. We don't want to just say everything that's on our mind all the time, but we've got to encourage them to share their thoughts, to share their ideas throughout their childhood and into their young adulthood, so that by the time they become professionals, there's not as much of the undoing of poor communication skills that we have to do.
Yeah, man, it's so true, Tim. I couldn't agree more. Like I think about my grandkid, and I'll trick with you on this because I think it's something that we all need, no matter where we are, what
Right.
stage we are in life. But like we went and spent time with them the other day, and as I was preparing to go, what I was very intentional about is just loving him and let him know how much I loved him. Right. And I think that's true for what you are describing. All of us want to be seen, heard, and valued.
Yes.
And so what you shared about taking the time to understand where people are coming from, taking the time to understand what some of those things that has shaped them, and maybe why they are not free to speak and communicate and so on. It stems around this whole idea of being seen, heard, and valued.
Yeah.
And I think we all need that. And at my stage in my life, I want to be seen, heard, and valued. And so I don't think that's something that is true for every person, period.
Right. Yeah, and every person at every stage of their life.
Exactly.
Right? I mean, the first time I heard John Maxwell say this, how do you know somebody needs encouragement? Because they're breathing.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. And I joke kind of another way. How do you know that I'm hungry? Because I'm awake. It's the. But it's one of those things that's just so simple that we forget.
Yeah.
We forget about it.
Yeah.
And then when it's brought back, you say, wow, it's so simple, but it's also so true.
Yeah.
It doesn't really matter where people are in their life. Like you said, they want to be seen, heard, and valued. And that's really the first step to building that connection and finding the common ground, or the way that you're going to build whatever it is that you're trying to build with somebody.
Yeah. Yeah, Tim. And that comes that the foundation of that is to recognize that it's not all about you.
Right.
I think what can get in the way of that is that I'm thinking about myself or my needs or my wants or what I'm trying to accomplish, my goals. And I think the more that I take the view off of myself and put it on others, is the better I experience life, because that's what it's all about. And but it's not easy. A lot of times it is around me. If I can be transparent, a lot of times I am thinking about me, and especially, you think about somebody who might have different beliefs than I do, or just fill in the blank for different. They're different than me. And sometimes I allow that difference, because I'm thinking about me, to get in the way of my relationship with them.
Yeah.
But what I want to be doing is thinking about them and trying to understand where they're coming from. And so therefore, really putting the attention and having a genuine interest on who they are.
Yeah, and that's kind of human nature to be thinking about yourself. I mean, it's just human nature there. And when you think about the whole idea of imposter syndrome, we're getting up in front of a group of people to speak, whether it's at a team meeting, on stage, at a job interview, what have you, and we think that everybody's thinking about us, but the reality is they're thinking about themselves.
Yes.
And so stepping outside of that whole thought process of thinking about yourself and start thinking about other people? How are you going to, what are you going to do to be able to connect with them? And part of that, first off, is being curious and
Yeah.
listening and
Yeah.
asking good questions.
Yep. It's so true. And there's it's and that's so amazing, as we do take interest in people. It's amazing how much they share. People really do hunger that. We all
Mhm.
do hunger that. Tim,
Yep,
if somebody takes a genuine interest in you, doesn't that motivate you to want to share? Like,
absolutely.
they really
Mhm.
want to know. They really care.
Mhm.
I know I feel that way. And so as we are that person for others, it's amazing what we can develop from that, because then it won't be long before you recognize that you have things in common.
Right.
And that's how actually, connections are made, and that's how relationships are built. And then when we find those things out, we have a genuine interest in wanting more, wanting to
Yeah.
connect more, wanting to
Yeah.
get
And
together again.
we focus, I think we focus too much on what what's different about ourselves as
Yes.
opposed to what do we have in common. I I'm just kind of making these numbers up, but I think as people, we probably agree, societally about 80% of the things, right? Doesn't really. I mean, I've never talked to anybody who says they don't want clean air, clean water. I've never talked to anybody that says they don't want to have safe schools. Never talked to anybody who's who says they want to argue with people all the time, right? So if we start with the things that we can agree on, and where we have common ground on, and maybe how we get to some of those other things we have difference of opinions on. But if we are curious and actually listen to what other people are saying, maybe, just maybe, number one, we may learn something, and maybe we may be able to come to a common solution that we can agree on.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And that's something that I can be transparent again, especially with a family. Sometimes
Yeah.
I have not done that well at that. Sometimes it's about, you get into conversations about things where I want to prove my point. I'm right and you're wrong.
Right.
And sometimes, Tim, that's led into heated conversations, and sometimes that's led to saying things that were rude and disrespectful, and literally getting into arguments. And so, full transparency, like I couldn't agree with you more, but it's something that I have struggled with over time, and for me, it's especially with family, and
Yeah.
and there's some particular family members that I can think of where that's actually transpired. But I think it is a sign of maturity for Robin to be able to not be thinking about wanting to prove my point, just to kind of follow along with what you were saying, because I think it's such a good subject that you're bringing, that all of us have to consider. It's really a part of our growth and how we show up.
Mhm.
And so we want to be showing up as that person who is, like you said, looking to learn, not to prove a point, looking to understand, to genuinely understand where somebody is coming from.
Right.
And then sometimes it might mean just agreeing to disagree. Doesn't mean you have to agree with them,
Right.
but you are taking the time to get to understand where they're coming from, more than you are trying to bring your point across.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's a lot of times where people lose track of things. You don't have to agree at all. I mean, it's perfectly fine to not agree, but the point is to understand, right? And to put yourself in a position so that you can hear and process, their side or their point of view, or why they did something the way that they did it, even if it didn't work out. Okay, we don't. Again, you don't necessarily have to agree, but now you have an understanding of how they got to that process,
Yes,
or
it's so
how
true.
they made those decisions.
It's so true. And that's such a good thing. One of the things that I uh, um, uh, uh, teach in my lead to last framework is that one of the most important things is how we view things. It's our perspective.
Hmm.
How you view things is how you do things. You've heard the thought,
Yes.
if you
Right.
think you
Hmm.
can or think you can't, you're right.
You're right. Hmm.
Right. And, how we view things, what we believe about ourselves, how we view ourselves determines how we show up. Right. What
Hmm.
we view about life is what we get from life. So that perspective is a really important thing. And so what I need to try to do is to step back and try to understand what somebody's perspective is. There is a viewpoint that is leading them to think and act the way that they do.
Hmm.
And the more that I can really try to step back to understand that, it's also the better that I will be able to help people as well. Because if I don't really understand that, how can I really help them if they need help,
Exactly.
right? I mean,
Right.
how can I serve them? Let's say that even better. How can I add value to them,
Value.
which is what you and I are about every day when you get right down to it. And the only way we're going to do that is if we can get to really understand their perspective. Why do they what do they believe? First of all, why do they believe what they believe, right?
Hmm.
What's behind
Right.
that? What is their perspective? What is their viewpoint? And what is it based on? Yeah, so healthy to be able to go there. And so, man, you're digging right into it here, sir.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit more about your framework, your lead to last framework. How do you take that? Give us a little bit more depth on it, and how do you take that and help leaders become better to help them lead with more value with their teams?
Yeah, man, that's a great question. It all stems from me, Tim. I owned an insurance agency. I built
Mhm.
and sold a successful insurance agency, a $10 million agency, 2.5 years ago. And through that process, I had to become a student of leadership. What happened, the long story short, is that our business grew well, but then, I became a bottleneck in our business. Like I was the rainmaker, I was the decision maker,
Mm.
I was the accountant, I was handling the problems that came in, I was handling the customer service, and the point is that all the decisions that needed to be made, pretty much most things that needed to be done, had to kind of come through me. And we were growing, and as we grew and I brought on people, we continued to grow. And then the business kind of stalled. It outgrew me, Tim.
Yeah.
That's the point. And that's when I had to make some changes. That's when I hired my first manager, and that's when I hired my first assistant, and that's when we started. I changed the focus from just bringing people on to now also developing them.
Hmm.
Equipping and developing them to be able to lead well, to be able to do what needed to be done, just as good or better than I could have, and then I would have. And then also that's when I started to put things into place, like systems and processes in place. Instead of I used to just kind of allow people to do things the way they thought it should be done.
Right.
And that's not a good plan.
No.
Because number one, everybody has a little different way they think it should be done, and number two, I had a way which I think it should be done, and meaning, and that could be very significant in some cases.
Oh
They're
yeah.
talking about
Right.
our values and how we show up to the world and so on. And the point of all that is that I realized that I needed to make a shift, and the challenge was me.
Hmm.
And so I became a student of leadership, and I started investing in my own personal development and my growth as a leader. And then it transferred over into some of these things that I mentioned to you. And so what has happened over time, a lot of times you realize, looking back at things, that you thought something was for you. But I now recognize, and a lot of what I have gone through and a lot of what I have learned, I now actually help people to go through as well.
Right.
And so this lead to last framework helps people to develop clarity and focus and grow as leaders, and to develop the resilience that they need in order to build lives and businesses that last, in a nutshell.
I love that. And, you talk a lot about purpose-driven, purpose-driven business owners and having a purpose. But,
Yeah.
I think sometimes it gets lost in translation here. So what's the difference between someone who says they have purpose and someone who actually leads with purpose?
Man, that's such a good question. So for me, what I refer to, have you heard the concept? I heard it from Rory Vaden. I don't know that he originated this thought, but he certainly is known for saying it, is that you are most powerfully equipped to serve the person you once were.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's one of the things that I wanted to do with my business, still do today, is for it to be more than just about the numbers,
right,
but for it to be about making an impact, making a difference.
Mm-hmm.
And so I found that the people that I best serve are those who are interested in more than just the numbers. They're also
right,
interested in making a difference, making an impact, serving their community. They're more concerned with developing people than using people. The underlying thing there is that they want to make a difference and make an impact.
That's so important, because talk is cheap, right?
It's so true.
Behavior is a language, right? And so somebody can say something, but then watch what they do, and people follow what people do, not what they say. And so, when you say you want to lead with purpose, you actually have to lead with purpose. What's your purpose? Have it stated, have it so everybody knows what your purpose is, and then go out and live that purpose.
Yeah.
That it's not something that you have to become. It's just who you are.
Yes, that's so good. I love it. And I agree with you, because I think it is a process, I think
Mm-hmm.
I grew into that.
Mm-hmm.
I did start out wanting, my goals were for Robin and family, I had the goal of paying off my mortgage. I had the goal of owning a boat. I had the goal of, a lot of the things that I was going after were things that were for me. Right. But I think you grow as you grow. And so, John Maxwell, your mentor, my mentor, talks about going from success to significance.
Yes.
I think there is a process there that, yes, we, go after success. And I think after we achieve success, or some degree of it, right? It all depends on what your definition of success is. But after you have achieved, you get to that next level, which is, how can I serve others? What am I doing to make an impact? Right. So I think it is you grow in stages, and so maybe I didn't start there. And so the person that I serve has already maybe built a successful business somewhat, and they get to realize that a lot of their business is still dependent on them. And so I come beside and help them now to put some of these things into place. And so, that's some of the distinction there.
And I think it goes back to what we opened the session with: crawling, walking, running, right? From a leadership perspective, from a business perspective. Yes, I'm not, this isn't right or wrong. It just kind of is. When you start a business, yes, you start it for you. You started to meet you and your family's wants and needs. And then as you start to hire people, now you realize, okay, I'm now responsible for somebody else's family, and creating something, either creating something or helping them create something for them. And then the more you hire people, and now you say, oh my gosh, I have no idea. This is where we're falling down. I have no idea how to truly help them. And this is where the leadership training and the coaching really comes into play, and our growth has to evolve with that as well.
Yes, it's so true. And yeah, and so what I do is help people go through that process. A lot of times you can look back and recognize some of the things that worked and the journey that you took.
Right.
And so I can help take people on a journey. Like one of the pillars of in the Lead to Last framework, for example, is clarity of self.
Yeah.
And one of the things there that I think a lot of us, period, whether you're a business owner, a leader, in an organization, or a leader of a family, is we lose sight of who we are. So identity is a big part of that we go through. What we believe about ourselves. A lot of us have limiting beliefs. I'm one of those. That's where I came from.
Me too.
Tim.
Right.
Me too. My personal testimony is that I struggled with self-doubt and uncertainty. And so it was hard for me, where that showed up in business, for example. Because a lot of times I didn't even realize, if you asked me that question, sometimes I wouldn't have answered it that way. But looking back, I realized I certainly did. I didn't have clear values, for example, for our company. A lot of times when I some of the mistakes that I made when I hired people, and this is the whole idea of crawling and falling and walking that you are talking about, is I hired a manager, for example, and I was allowing them to come in and create the culture that they thought we needed, and that's not the way that it works. But I did that out of uncertainty of myself and lack of clarity of what my values are. So the clarity of self goes through some of those things. Who are you apart from your role? Put your role to the side. Who are you? What do you believe about yourself? And where does that come from? Is it based upon the truth? Or is it based upon maybe something that happened to you, maybe an authority figure in your life earlier on, or maybe a peer out on the playing field of life, or whatever, right? We all have beliefs that are limiting beliefs about ourselves. And as you and I mentioned earlier on, we can't get beyond that. It puts a ceiling on what we can achieve. The other part of that is the story that we tell ourselves. A lot of times we tell ourselves stories. We're convinced that they're true, but a lot of times it's just based upon a belief that we formed. And so we help people to acknowledge those and then work on changing them. And then the last part of that is values. What are your values?
Values, yeah.
Right? Like really, and then what are you going to do to really manage living that out? And so that's just an example of something, because the first person to lead in leadership is yourself. It's myself. And so part of that is getting clarity around who I am. And, through that process, you gain confidence with the clarity, you gain a focus of what you are about. And then you get this clarity around purpose as well, recognizing that you are here in this earth with purpose.
Right.
You have a unique purpose that only you can bring. Tim, in other words, there's no other Tim Newman.
Exactly.
There's no other Robin Lewis. It's just one. The mold has been put away. And so there is a uniqueness that we bring. There's a uniqueness that every one of our listeners bring to this world that only they can bring. And the more that we can buy into that, recognize that, and then come from that, is the better we're going to live, the better we're going to be fulfilled, and the more of a difference that we'll make in whether in the business world, in the whatever world, wherever we are, how, like you said, how we show up.
Yeah. And I think about this a lot. We don't teach kids or the younger generation to do that type of introspection at all. Right. We just kind of expect that it's going to happen. And then all of a sudden now we're 30 and we don't know who we are as individuals. We don't know what we truly believe, what we truly value. And now we're expected to just come up with it. how do we change that culture? How do we get people to truly start thinking about who they are at a much younger age and understand that obviously some things are going to change as we get older. You know, our core values probably should not change, but some of the things that we believe or how we come about things, if they don't evolve over time, then we're probably doing life wrong. But how do we teach people to do that type of introspection when they're younger so that it doesn't become such a problem or become such a burden when they get older?
Yeah, it's such a good question, sir. And I would pause and just congratulate you, first of all, for one of the ways to answer that question is what you do through your podcast. You're sharing these types of principles and truths for your listeners. And so I think a lot of it is making people aware. I think the second part of that is mentoring. I think we have a responsibility to be passing that on. And then, that leads me to where I think it starts. It starts in the home, right? So I want to try to be able to help to instill these types of principles, or to help my kids. No, my we only have one, and she's a mom now, so she's beyond these stages. But not to say we're always a parent, right? We can always share.
Oh yeah,
right. But especially like you're asking for the younger ages, to do that and encourage that in the home, right?
Yeah.
Take time out to have those types of discussions with your kids. If there's somebody listening to us today and you have younger kids, that's something that I would encourage you to do. Have those types of discussions. Share what yours are, Tim. I think a good place is for you as an adult, the parent then that we're speaking to, is what are your values, right? And are you sharing them with your kids? Tim, I hear a lot of parents talk about that now. Myself and my wife, her name is Edna, we didn't do that well growing up. We did to a certain extent. But we didn't have, like some people have like family meetings where they're discussing the values of the family. Like my last name is Lewis. The Lewis family, here's who we are. Here's what we believe. And I think the more that we can do that, the better it's going to encourage our kids to also consider that for themselves. Right. So we're having discussions around those things. These are the type of things that I want to share with my grandson, right? As he grows older, I want to try and instill them. So that's what I mean, where I think it starts from home. But then if we go beyond that now it's about doing what Tim is doing and bringing this to the world. Now it's about what Robin is doing and helping people individually to try and figure these things out. And so you and I are about helping to add value to people's lives. And I think that's that's one of the places, as I mentioned, that we start. And so, we can't maybe do them all, right? There's how many billion people in this world, but we can start with one, and then that one can make a difference.
Well, and I'm glad you said that, because, I talk about that all the time, in that we can't necessarily worry about what's happening on a macro level. We can only really affect the people that are in our inner circle.
Yeah.
Right. And it's like the ripple, throw a pebble in a body of water and watch the ripples. I can affect you, and hopefully you'll throw a pebble, and then they'll throw a pebble, and they'll throw a pebble. And that's how we get to more significance, to more people. But
I love the thought.
Focus on what you can control, or focus on what's near you, and that's what's going to really help.
Yeah.
And I actually threatened my kids last week that we were getting ready to have another family meeting, about where we all live, because just trying to coordinate stuff. I said, if you guys don't get together and you don't move down here, I'm going to call a family meeting, and I'm going to make all the decisions and pack up your houses.
I love it. Oh gosh. But sir, I do want to emphasize something that you talked about there, and it's really about collaborating. So yeah, what I can do by myself is only so much, and I can make a difference. But what I can do with others who want to make a difference,
Yes.
yeah, can multiply. And so I think we live in a world now where it's usually it's more about us against them. It's more about being divisive, and you stay over there and I'll stay over here. But what I hear you talking about is the more that we can actually come together
Ca-
around, let's just say what
Yes.
you were talking about. How can we
Yeah.
help the next generation with this? It's
Mhm.
about how you want Tim and Robin getting together and with others and figuring out how we can, you know. Um, Work together to multiply the impact. It's so important. Such an
Yeah.
important.
Tim Elmore does a really good job with generational research and intergenerational working together. But I think, and I buy into it 100%, right? But I think a lot of times, a lot of the communication and leadership breakdowns aren't necessarily generational, because we can find common ground. They're personality based. How are you using tools like DISC to help leaders stop misreading people, so they can learn how to interact with people that approach things differently?
Oh man, it's a huge tool. It's I talk about patterns when I talk about the
Mhm.
stories that we tell ourselves in the clarity of self pillar.
Mhm.
I talk about the patterns that we have, and that's what disc. So I bring up disc
Mhm.
as a big part of that, because what disc is for our listeners is it's a personality assessment that helps us to understand, and it's based upon a model called disc, where you have four muscles, I like to call them.
Mhm.
And so we have all of these four. So it's not about putting somebody in a box, but there we by this assessment, we can tell which muscles have been developed the most.
Yeah.
And based upon those muscles, we can see patterns and tendencies that we all have. And the beauty of that, Tim, is that not just that we get to understand ourselves, but then we also get to understand the patterns that others have as well. And then we can get to adjust our communication accordingly. We can get to adjust our understanding of where they're coming from, why they do what they do. Sometimes, like my wife and I have different personality types. And sometimes she can do things, and I guess I shouldn't say that without being specific, but she's a DI, so she's the dominant. She's a task oriented. She wants to get right to it. So if she comes into a place, she's getting right to the task at hand. And sometimes it's very easy for her to walk right past people without even saying hello and going right to what it is that she needs to get done, because she knows
Mhm.
she's here to get this done.
You gotta get it
And
done right.
sometimes I might look at that and say, "Oh my goodness, did you realize you just walked past him? Did you realize that?" And it's not that I'm making. This is another very important part of that this process, by the way. In fact, let me just stop and say it right now. So it's not an excuse for Edna to walk past him. Edna now has to understand her
Stand.
tendency, and then she has to recognize that Tim is a person and is more important and needs to be acknowledged. And so she has to make the adjustment. She has to pull on the other muscles that she has. Maybe she doesn't have the tendencies, not her go-to. She's after the task, but she has to come back and recognize that, hey, Tim is here. And so that is a part of it too, where we develop ourselves when we
Yeah.
understand our patterns. But coming back to what you were saying, now understanding that about her, it doesn't drive me as crazy as it did before,
Right.
And maybe it might just be for me to say to her, hey, by the way, you remember Tim is there. And not take it like she doesn't really care about Tim, because she cares about Tim. It's not, I wondered about that when I didn't understand this, Tim. So to answer your question, it helps you to understand people and therefore communicate with them a whole lot better. And people can learn that about you and therefore communicate with you a whole lot better as well.
It's I like that you use the idea that it's a muscle.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that, John Maxwell talks a lot about is walking slowly through the hall, right? And
Yes.
the reason for that, and that is just not me. I got to get from point A to point B because I got stuff to do. And my wife and I went to an event this week, and I told her before we got there, I said, one of the things that we're going to do today is walk slowly through the hall.
Yeah, I like it.
And practice that.
Yeah.
And she didn't understand what I meant right away. And then when I kind of explained to her, say, yeah, you really need to start doing that. But it's understanding who we are as an individual and what we need to do to Robin, it goes back to what we talked about at the very top of the show, right? Learning and getting better at things and trying things and not getting up when we fall down, understanding that we're where our weaknesses are. And for me, walking slowly through the halls and making connections with people in between. I'm good at making connections at point A. I'm good at making connections at point B, but I'm horrible at making connections in between point A and point B.
Yeah.
And understanding that and learning that and finding ways to get better at something that we know that we're not good at. That's part of being a leader. That's part of being an adult. That's part of being a professional, and finding ways to be able to do that is critical.
That is so true. And it's true about life. I agree with you. It's a very important principle that you're sharing. There are a lot of things that, I realized that I thought I knew, but I didn't know. But the more that I go along, there are some things that I know that I know that I know even more.
Right.
And what you're sharing is one of them. Is that we crawl, we fall, we walk. And that's how we live life. That's how, and we have to, it's uncomfortable. Like putting yourself in that situation that you just described, being in between the A and B is uncomfortable, right? You don't feel comfortable there. You're stretching yourself. You're going outside of the norm for yourself. But that's the only way. You got to crawl. But if you do it, then you're going to get better at it. And you're going to get better at it. And then you're going to fall. But then you're going to start walking in that regard. And Tim, I think one of the things that like I had, if I can be transparent with you, we just had one child, our daughter. And even as an adult, like in her 20s, I remember sitting down with her and I wanted her to understand that I may have messed up as a dad. There were a couple of times where my approach to discipline her was not the best approach. She did something that I didn't think it was a good thing for her to do. And my reaction to her was not the best. So I've apologized to her, even before what I'm sharing with you now. But I was so concerned with not wanting to. I didn't want to paint the picture that failure is a bad thing. That's the thing as a parent, that I did not want to paint that picture to her. And so I came back to her as an adult and I spoke specifically about that, because you and I know, Tim, that failure and success actually go together.
Right.
Yeah, your only way you're going to be successful is to crawl, to fall, and to walk. You're not going to be good at whatever it is that you're attempting the first time. You're not going to be. You're going to fail, right? And
exactly.
And so we have to become comfortable with that. And I think sometimes we take it too personally. We're fearful of what others think or say or how we might look. And there's I don't mean to make light of that. There's that could come from a father figure like me. Like how I treated my daughter when she was growing up, and I wasn't that bad. I don't want to paint the wrong picture. I wasn't that terrible.
Robin, we all make mistakes. I mean,
yes, that's the point. And it can affect others. Like that's a significant role that we play in somebody's life. And so, so I think we can. If somebody's listening to us today, that failure is getting in the way, that maybe you've you are defining yourself by it. Here, Tim and I, to you today, failure does not define you. It's actually a good thing because now you know the way that doesn't work. So you can make adjustments. The key to making the most of failure is learning from it. When my grandson falls, he gets back up and he tries something a little bit different. And
Yeah.
just trying to, when he was learning how to balance himself, he didn't, think that it meant that he couldn't walk. Are you hearing
That's
me,
it. Yeah.
listener? And so he got back up and then he tried something else. That doesn't work. Let me try it this way. And he fell a few times. We're going to fall as we go along in life. But the key there is learning from it, making the adjustment, and then getting back up again. And that's one of those truths that I know to be true. And I think it's one of the themes, like you said, Tim,
Yeah.
in our discussion today.
Mm-hmm. It really is. And you said some things that made me think about a couple of different things. I had a very similar conversation with my oldest daughter just yesterday, where she made a mistake with my granddaughter, and I properly chastised her. Don't you treat my granddaughter that way. But we had that conversation. And
Yeah.
and I said, here are 7 things that I remember very vividly where I made mistakes with you and your sister. And I just listed them off. And she said, I can't believe you still think about those things. Of course I think about those things because I made mistakes. You guys still turned out okay, but I don't want you to make those mistakes. But if you do, it's still going to be okay. Right. It's not that's part of it. Another one is I just took a class, finished a class maybe last week. And part of the final exam was the instructor was going through my PowerPoints. Okay. And she was picking them apart. Your letters are too close together. They have to be a little bit bigger. This isn't centered, whatever it is. And she said, I'm sorry I'm being so picky. And I said, no, this is what you're supposed to do. I'm a big boy. We're doing this for me to get better. And she said, well, a lot of people don't like being corrected that way. I said, well, I can't, that's on them. I took this class because I want to get better. And you as the instructor aren't doing anybody any favors if you're not doing your job, if you're not being critical, because these PowerPoints, I could be delivering a virtual class to 20,000 people. And if it's not right, if it doesn't look good, then I'm not delivering the value that I need to be delivering to them. They're not getting the message. They may not be getting the message.
Yes.
It could affect so many other things. So it's okay to be, as an individual, not perfect, but be open to being corrected, be open to fixing things, be open to not having things done perfectly, and that's fine, but be open to hearing that criticism.
Yes, it's so true. And I think it's a valid point for your message. So you're living it, like your message is, speaking with confidence and, how to communicate well. And you're living that out as you are improving in regards to that PowerPoint, whatever it was that you were presenting. You're going to be more confident as you make those mistakes, and as you learn and you apply that, you're going to be a better communicator. Yeah. And so it clearly applies to your message, Tim. It's step out. You're going to. I teach people this about public speaking, for example. The only way you're going to get better is to actually speak.
Yes.
Right. A lot of times we allow the fear of it to get in the way of us even doing it. But you have to apply the crawl, fall, and walk in that regard. You're not going to be the best the first time. You're probably not going to be the best the second time. You're not going to be the best the third time either. But the point is that it takes you actually going through it and falling, failing, messing up, learning from it, and then improving. changing a little bit for the next time, but then step out again. And so it's such a good principle to apply when it comes to speaking with confidence and communication in general.
So, Robin, where can people connect with you and learn more about your work with purpose-driven leaders?
Yeah, well, so they can go to robinlewisleadership.com, robinlewisleadership.com. Or Tim, if there's somebody here that wants to dive in a little bit more in terms of strategy on their business and their leadership, they can set up a call at freeleadershipstrategycall.com. freeleadershipstrategycall.com.
And I'll put those links in the show notes, and also make sure they listen to your podcast. Can be found wherever podcasts can be listened to.
Wherever they listen to on podcasts. It's the Big Life podcast. I co-host it with Neil Oates Jr. So it's the Big Life podcast. And thank you for allowing that, Tim. I appreciated being here with you today, sir.
Robin, I really enjoyed the conversation. It's always good talking with you and catching up with you. And take care, and we'll talk to you soon.
All right, man. Bless you.
Be sure to visit speakingwithconfidencepodcast.com to get your free ebook, Top 21 Challenges for Public Speakers and How to Overcome Them. You can also register for the Formula for Public Speaking course. Always remember, your voice has the power to change the world. We'll talk to you next time. Take care.